A stronger day, be your best every day. Hi, I'm Adimus, founder and director of Strong Optimizer. I aim to help you stay healthy, be happier, and deal with challenges with greater resilience. Have you heard of the term well-being? Are you confused with the many definitions of well-being and what you can do to develop your well-being capability? Today, you will meet Professor Lindsay Oades. Lindsay will unpack for you the fascinating worlds of well-being and what you can do to optimize your well-being capability through the interaction between you and your broader environment. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Adimus. I'm the founder and director of Strength Optimizer. Thank you for watching Strength Optimizer, the Science Up Your Wellbeing series. Today we have Professor Lindsay Oades joining us. Professor Lindsay is the director at the Center for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. He's also an internationally acclaimed well-being public policy strategist, author, and researcher. Professor Lindsay leads a team of well-being educators and researchers who promote and investigate how people learn to improve their well-being in education, health, community, and organizations. It's so great that you can join us today, Lindsay. And how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Adimus. It's lovely to be with you today, and also hello to everyone who's listening.
Wonderful. So, Lindsay, I noticed that you wear multiple hats in the well-being field. How would you describe yourself as a well-being scientist and practitioner?
Oh, that's quite a difficult question to answer. I think I have worked originally as a practitioner. I originally trained as a clinical psychologist and worked as a clinical psychologist. But what has happened over time is I've worked across several sectors. Firstly, in the health sector, particularly with people with serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia. Then I spent a fair bit of time doing workplace wellbeing out of Sydney Business School, and more recently, as you know, Adimus, in terms of working with the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne, so more into an education sector. So I guess I'm a wellbeing scientist, but an applied wellbeing scientist. That is, the wellbeing science is thought of across different sectors in terms of how do we help people improve their own well-being or help others improve their well-being. And as we'll probably talk about, how do we help people learn how to improve their well-being, not leave it to chance, but intentionally learn and educate not only individuals but organisations and communities in that endeavour. So I'm an applied well-being scientist, but with particular context in mind.
Yep, excellent. And sounds like you have a vast experiences from different settings, different disciplines, ranging from working, as you mentioned earlier, people with severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, to the general public, a community in promoting their own level of well-being.
Yeah, and I think I learned as I went on what I was interested in, and that broadly based wellbeing science fits the topic, but it can look and feel very differently, or look and feel very different in different contexts, be it health or business or education, or in public policy itself. Yeah. And that's what interests me is how is it still the same, but different depending on where it's applied.
Yes, so sounds like context is everything once again when we talk about well-being.
Yeah.
All right. So we know that the word well-being is used in many ways in many places. Some associate well-being to feeling good and happiness, and others relate well-being to resilience and mental health. How would you explain well-being and why well-being matters, Lindsay?
Oh, that's a very big question in the sense of we spend a lot of time talking about exactly that question: what is well-being? And rather than giving a single definition, I probably try and outline a few different ways of approaching the question. Probably one of the big things is firstly distinguishing it from happiness, or happiness as it's talked about, say in the English-speaking countries, in terms of happiness being positive emotions or hedonic happiness, this idea of more pleasure than pain. Most scholars, apart from those who are hedonists themselves in terms of that view, would think of well-being as a more complex concept. And one of the ways to make that more tangible is firstly distinguishing it between objective and subjective. So when we actually approach the question, do we think of it primarily as a subjective thing, that is something we experience? Do we think of it as something which has these objective qualities which can be observed or measured external to the self? So things like quality of life or standard of living, which are more economic type concepts often, they're considered objective, whereas one's experience of a pleasure or a pain or an emotion is considered subjective. So depending on where you position yourself in those sort of debates will tell you a lot about your particular definition of well-being. I'm more in the subject. I personally am more in the subjective side of well-being, but that's just, I don't see well-being in isolation. I see it alongside other concepts like thriving and like flourishing. So it's not that one is good and all the others are bad. More importantly, in my view, is be really clear about what you're talking about. And so one of the things also that people forget often is that well-being, or at least according to the well-being philosophers, is a normative concept. So it's talking about how things should be. So well-being is not only that we feel good or function well, it's what's good for us. So it's something that we value and aim for, not just a standard description of the state, but actually, not well-being is what's good for us, which is different than happiness. We can feel happy or feel positive, feel nice emotion. That may or may not be good for us, depending on what else is happening. But the actual ethical or normative aspect of goodness, what's good for us, is also part of well-being. So what I'm trying to highlight here is there are a lot of ways of defining it or measuring it. Objective and subjective is one, and remembering that it's a normative concept, and that will tend to differentiate it also from happiness. And typically people will, particularly in psychology, there'll be a distinction drawn from philosophy, which is the hedonic versus the eudaimonic, living a good life idea, which has an ethical component, which is similar to what I was just talking about. But most people won't think of it at that depth. A lot of people don't understand how the sheer breadth of well-being. It's a multidisciplinary concept. You'll find it in economics, you find it in philosophy, you find it in psychology, you find it in human geography, you'll find it in sociology. It is quite a pervasive, broad concept. Usually only people have heard of it in one area, and they don't realise how broad and important it is as a unifying idea of the social sciences, really.
Wow. So it sounds like well-being is such a complex, huge, multifaceted, multidimensional concepts. And as you said, later on, you're going to find a bit more in terms of how we can actually help people to develop the well-being capability or even to thrive, especially if so many of us have different understandings and experience when it comes to well-being. But we'll certainly cover that a little bit more later. Thank you, Lindsay. I know that one of your famous quotes, or at least something that helped you say it very frequently and often, is this word that well-being is everyone's business. So can you elaborate that for us a little bit more?
I certainly can. Yeah, it's really the issue around who's responsible. That phrase was actually drawn from another campaign, which was suicide is everyone's business. So it's really getting about who is responsible, and that particular idea of well-being is everyone's business is exactly that, the idea of a shared responsibility, and that one of the biggest drivers of well-being is relationships. and the quality of our relationships, sense of belonging, and that idea of community. So a lot of wellbeing, you can consider it as existing between and among people, not just within an individual.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of an underlying political philosophy in there as well, and that is not leaving everything to an individual. So a libertarian worldview probably wouldn't fit with that claim.
Yeah.
But I'm also heavily influenced by some of the communitarian politics as well, which is looking at the role of the community, and how we learn our ethics from community and regulate ourselves in that way. So wellbeing as everyone's business is both a plea to share the responsibility for wellbeing, but also looking at the politics of wellbeing, which is really that shared responsibility. And if we want to make that more tangible, if we actually have a look at what's been happening during COVID, and how different societies and communities are responding, and whether you actually want to behave in a way where you care about people more than yourself, or whether you behave in a way where you only care about self. And if wellbeing is everyone's business, then everyone is responsible for everyone's wellbeing.
Yeah.
And you'll see that playing out in certain places in the world, and in other places in the world, you'll see a more very individualist way of viewing it. And so you wouldn't necessarily care about other people's well-being, and it's your right to take care of your own without responsibility for others.
Okay.
So it on the face of it, that phrase sounds very straightforward and very simple, but it quickly runs quite a bit deeper when you think about the politics of well-being.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, one way of asking it is, who's responsible for your well-being? And whenever I ask that question, who's responsible for your well-being or who's responsible for your health, people will automatically, or at least in an Australian context, fairly individualist society, they will say, oh, I'm responsible. But then I say, all right, well, so we can get rid of all government services for health then, can we? And they'll say, no, of course not. So it's really, most importantly, it's a discussion about responsibility and potentially shared responsibility for wellbeing. And as I said, that's particularly relevant because we know so much that the quality of our relationships is such an important predictor of wellbeing.
Yeah. So in other words, you're saying that there is actually a limitation of how much we are responsible for our personal well-being.
I think there's a shared responsibility, and that's where it becomes political philosophy, because there are particular views on political philosophy that would say that, whereas there are other views that view us as more isolated individuals who do transactions, and that's where it rapidly becomes exactly that. It becomes political philosophy rather than just well-being as a lot of people think of it in a psychological way.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I'm definitely, I guess, that more than happy to know, at least, I guess, the confidence to know that my own level of well-being is actually interconnected to a broader context, whether it's in relation to my family, whether it's in relation to other people, to workplaces and the broader community, and having the understanding or at least the agreement to know that well-being is shared responsibility, for me, is a lot more doable to give it all in this together. So definitely, yes.
Yeah. And the other way of thinking about it, people go, people say, oh, actually, it's all up to me. But then they're saying that means that the environment has no effect, which is quite an absurd position to take, to say that the environment doesn't have an effect on us. If we said that in a physical way, it would basically be saying if we had no water, we'd still be okay. That's an absurd statement. And I would say it's equally absurd. We are social beings. We do need relationships, and we know that too. There's lot of evidence for that. So another way of thinking about it is other people are our social environment, and therefore they have a significant impact on our well-being, and vice versa. So that's another way of thinking about that.
Excellent, excellent. And I know that, Lindsay, you're also a strong advocate in teaching people, organizations, and community to learn well-being capability. So what exactly is the well-being capability, and how can we learn this well-being capability?
Okay, so it's firstly probably starting with what a capability, or how I'm defining a capability in those types of claims. So you'll see from people like Amir Tassen, as an economist, talks about a capability as something that enables us to be or to do things. So it's this sort of potentiality. And he was talking about that in an economic sense. And Martha Nussbaum has done similar things with a capabilities approach, which has led to the things like the Human Development Index. So this idea of what we can be and do, and it very much relates to what we were just talking about in terms of the role of the environment. So we can teach people skills and knowledge, but actually the environment has to afford them the opportunity to be able to use those skills and knowledge. So for example, we can teach a child how to ride a bike. So they might have the skill of riding a bike, but they're not capable if they don't have a bike. So that's where the economic part comes in. That is getting everyone a bike, or getting some people getting the option to be able to ride a bike. So one of the things I like capability as an organising concept for wellbeing, because a lot of what you'll see in some of the in the health discourse around wellbeing, it's often turned into discussion of mental health prevention and promotion. Yes. It's very important. It's very important to prevent mental illness. Extremely important. But essentially, I would argue that's actually a different conversation than talking about wellbeing. Wellbeing is a broader concept than the absence of mental illness. Yeah. Wellbeing includes many things, and it varies depending on a person's opinion as to what they value and how they'll achieve their well-being. And it probably is much more difficult for them to achieve well-being if they have a mental illness, but they're not the same concept. Okay. So I would argue that capability is actually a better concept to organise well-being than talking about prevention or promotion of health or mental illness. So in that sense, there's two things that go on. We educate, so that's with the teaching and learning of skills and knowledge about wellbeing, such as positive education, for example. Yeah. But we can't forget the environment. So to be capable, we also have to change the environment or the ecosystem. So yes, we can educate individuals and communities in skills and knowledge around wellbeing, but we also need to build an environment that affords people the opportunity to use them. So capability gets us to think about both, and I would argue it's very easy for psychologists to forget the environment and go into just teaching things about what's going on inside our body boundary and inside our skin, our emotions and our thoughts, our behaviour. But it's also very easy for economists to talk about systems and forget about the psychology. So I believe that capability is a good concept to build around, because it necessarily requires us to think both about what's happening for an individual psychologically, but also what's happening in the broader environment, be it a social or a physical or an economic environment. So just to summarise, to be capable is what we can be and do, but to do that, you have to have skills and knowledge interacting with an environment. And that's why we've got to teach people skills and knowledge about wellbeing, such as wellbeing literacy is how we can communicate about wellbeing, but also make changes to the environment, be that changes to an organisation, changes to an economy, to develop an environmental ecosystem, a wellbeing ecosystem, which enables us to experience wellbeing, because it isn't, you can't separate the person from their environment.
Yes.
But sometimes our models or disciplines unwittingly do that.
Okay. So to be specific, when you're talking about the connections between the person and the environment when it comes to learning wellbeing capability, so who exactly are the, I guess, that what you want to use the words, people who are responsible or even leaders in making all this happen? Because obviously, in one sense, we look at the school, you talk about positive education, so immediately I think about teachers. But if we move beyond the wellbeing capability, beyond the school setting, again, who is so-called qualified to teach, and how do we make all these things happen?
Oh, that's a good question. I think if you go to our what I'd call some of our key learning environments, if we break society down into its different parts, the home or the family is one. So that would be one of the most fundamental. So the family and parenting, and then you've got schools, you have workplaces, and then you have community organisations, be they religious or non-religious community organisations, or be they sport-based organisations. In some cultures, sports are a big thing.
Yeah.
So they're all potential learning environments in which people will communicate about and for wellbeing, and it can look very different. They don't have to be using words that positive psychologists use. They could be talking about sport, or they could be talking about their child. That's all. They're all actually well-being. So that's why it's such a powerful organising framework to talk about across different contexts. So it might be a leader of a sports club. It might be a parent. It might be a teacher. It might be an employer. That's how pervasive the concept of well-being is. It goes across many places. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Leaders in those different contexts would share, in my view, some responsibility, or should share some responsibility for well-being.
Yeah. And hence, once again, your famous quote, well-being is everyone's business. Different part of organization, different people who are responsible in creating, whether it's a well-being culture or policy or practices. If they do see that as important, I guess, for the organizations, then perhaps that's where the dialogues can begin. That's where the conversation or learning can start as well.
Yes. Yeah. And the alternative paradigm to that is as I've said, a traditional medical view is, they say well-being, but they actually mean illness or mental illness. And then they talk about bringing in professionals and seeking professional support, which I fully agree with. But that's not relevant for it's not immediately relevant for every person. It's relevant if people are at risk of or are having a mental illness problem. We potentially could say it's relevant to everyone, but at that immediate time, it's not. Whereas I would argue that wellbeing is relevant to everyone all of the time. And it's a slightly different conversation.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And if I may ask that question in a slightly different way, especially, in the context of COVID-19, and again, many things that people are experiencing right now, people do struggle to maintain a positive well-being. So how do we help others to thrive in this very destructive, this very uncertain decade or era of our time?
Oh, that's a very topical question, and we've literally been writing some things on that, and other people have been writing about it. We've seen how people have tried. I mean, one of the things that's suddenly become very more obvious to people is how important human relationships are. Not so much from COVID itself, but from the restrictions and isolation that came from keeping people separate due to social distancing, or physical distancing, as it's probably better called. So finding ways to connect and maintain human relating has been one key aspect of that. But also people have been much more intentional about how they spend their time. So in terms of using the day to do things they would probably normally do, but in a restricted environment find it more difficult to do. So probably if I had to name two straight off the top of it, it would be that social connection factor and probably some aspect of self-regulation or habit use, intentional use of habits or development of habits. The other thing that's become very obvious is people's ability or inability, probably inability is too strong, difficulty in dealing with uncertainty. Uncertainty is often at the core of anxiety, and how well people have or haven't dealt with that during this period has probably been a fairly large factor in how well they've tracked through this period. And I'm talking psychologically here, I'm not talking medically. Like obviously if you have COVID, then managing that's a whole different issue in the actual medical sense of COVID-19. So there's a few factors involved in that. One of the things I'm struck by though is how much more people have been talking about well-being because of COVID-19. And in many ways, what I view COVID-19 almost as a teacher, because systematically what's happened in those places that have had restrictions placed on them by governments, a lot of the things that drive well-being have systematically been taken away. The ability to go to work, the ability to socialise, the ability to exercise or play sport. A lot of the things that give us a sense of well-being have literally been systematically dismantled. And it's almost like a cruel experiment where you take away all these things bit by bit and what's left. And so many of the social and psychological drivers of well-being have been taken away during periods of restriction or lockdown or stay-at-home orders. And so that is particularly challenging. And now I think as a result of that, people have got more awareness of the psychological and social drivers of well-being, and not only the biological and disease drivers of ill-being.
That is so true. I guess that sometimes we take all these things that you talk about, whether it's social connections, whether it's exercise, whether it's walking the nature for granted, but when it's suddenly being taken away, so to speak, and then it sort of intensify that, hey, these are the drivers, these are the indicators that actually help me to sustain my well-being. And moving forward, and hopefully this will be a continuing journey for people to, as you used the word earlier, to intentionally build around the well-being habits to sustain and to even enhance our own well-being and well-being others as well. That's good. Well, I'm afraid that that's all the time that we have for today. It's always a joy to talk to you, Lindsay, and once again, for taking your time to share with us your insights and your wisdom in the science and applications of well-being. And if you want to engage Lindsay's expertise in obviously well-being science, leadership, and positive psychology, make sure you visit his website at lindsayOades.com. I repeat that again, it's lindsayOades, OADES.com. And thank you for watching. I'm Demas from Strength Optimizer. We're here to help you to bring out the best in you through optimizing your strengths. Thank you, everyone. Have an awesome day. Bye.